And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course, the mothership, coalitionradio.us. Should you hear this show in the coming days, weeks, we'd ask you just to take a moment and follow us, like us, do all the normal stuff. Again, your support of us on social media allows us to sort of break through the noise. In the prior session, we had two esteemed doctors join us and talk about single-payer health insurance, a topic that you're not going to typically get in any sort of detail, really anywhere on the media. It's independent media that provides us the opportunity to have conversations with them, and like our guest, who is now officially, as we said last time, a repeat offender here on the Coalition. Professor Andrew Hernandez is on the faculty of the Western New Mexico University. Time and time again, we've referred to the astonishing array of courses he teaches, whether it be the history of the border and the warfare and the civil strife and the issues that surround Texas and New Mexico and Mexico from the turn of the 18th and 19th century on forward, whether it be issues surrounding governments like Nicaragua in Central America and some of the challenges they face in terms of infrastructure and government. On a little bit more salacious level, but equally as important, talking about narco terrorism, the asylum system, refugees, cross-border transportation, and of course the drug war, which of course is the center, if you will, the epicenter, the ground zero for so many of the conflicts, so many of the challenges facing us both on our Latin American border and for folks in Central and Latin and South America. So it is a great pleasure that I reintroduce us to Professor Hernandez. Thank you again for joining us. Merry Christmas and the best of all to your family. Thank you for spending some time on a Friday night with us.
Thank you, Pat. I'm happy to be here.
We have an awful lot of fun, and I hope sometime soon. I mean, does Western New Mexico University? It's sort of a tongue twister. What is the mascot there, by the way?
The Mustang.
The Mustangs. Does the home of the Mustangs do electronic courses yet? Can we take one of your courses as a far away student?
You can. My entire load this term is online.
Really?
And that's going to be true for the spring as well. So I'll make a cheap plug here. I have a class on Latin America and the drug war in the spring. I have a class on the drug wars again in the spring. And I have classes on World Civ and Modern Latin America in the spring. Kind of more general survey courses.
Holy cow. Now, do you have to be a matriculating student at the home of the Mustangs, the Western New Mexico University, to take your courses?
We have many people who already have degrees who come back just to further their education, and they take the classes for credit and for audit.
Wow, all right. So we're gonna have, over the break, we're gonna have to figure out a way to publicize that, because I have a feeling that there's things that you're going to talk about in those classes you're not going to get at a New England liberal arts school. Just a reflection, of course, of your not only your academic pursuits, but your kind of feet on the street role there, living just, as we like to say, 33 miles north of the Mexican border in scenic small town America, Deming, New Mexico, which actually, if you get a chance to go down there, by the way, I've gotten word that up in Albuquerque, there's talk of a minor league baseball or soccer stadium. Yeah, and we don't like public money going into stadiums like that at the Coalition. So I've already spoken with a couple of people on that issue. I'm going to do everything I can for no reason other than to get back to New Mexico, try and wangle a trip out of this one. But the interesting news just today, Amazon had said they wouldn't move to New York City without some very generous subsidies, and lo and behold, they're moving there anyway. Amazing. It's sort of like that six-figure job in government. That they always seem to get about 220,000. I always say, I wonder if they would have taken it for 170. And when you offer value, and by the way, New Mexico is an astonishingly beautiful state. I was blown away by it when I was there just a few months ago. I think it's a question of government just finding the beauty in itself and what it has to offer people without having to, lay down, open up the larder. I could see how people of a variety of backgrounds would love to live in a place like New Mexico. It's really, again, it's an astonishing place. And yet, I don't know it's on the tips of everyone's tongue to go there. I think it's just really up to the New Mexican government to point out, the lifestyle, the affordability relatively to many parts of the country, and all the beauty. And I think I wish they would do more of that than just feel like they have to stroke a check.
The local joke is that just about everybody who lives here at one point or another has been told they're not a citizen of the United States. So I'll make a cheap plug here. There's a blog called One of Our 50 is Missing, and there's actually a book decades ago published by the Albuquerque Journal of various anecdotes of people asked for their passport or told that they can't mail order something because the seller only ships to the United States and that kind of thing. Those are daily stories, but New Mexico does try to stay on the map, especially for domestic tourism in the U.S.
Absolutely. So we've got a couple of things we want to cover this week. Let's talk about the asylum system. It would appear, and there are always unintended consequences to legislation. There are always unintended consequences, particularly when in this administration, and I'm a critic of this administration when it comes to their views, if you will, if you want to dignify them with that, with their views on immigration. I've always alleged, and I'm not going to ask you to comment on this, but I've always alleged that this is a ready, shoot, aim approach to the dynamics that make up an increasingly sophisticated yet increasingly troubled geoeconomic politics between Central America and in our border, particularly given the presence of a significant manufacturing space in and around northern Mexico. So what's happening here? Give us a snapshot.
So I'll go really big, and then we'll hone in a bit on my area. Mm-hmm. We've talked about this before on a few other shows, but the primary problem here is that there's a global problem. There are, as I've mentioned before, arguably more people who are displaced right now across the globe. The UN High Commission on Refugees puts the number north of 70 million people. More people displaced right now than in World War II itself. And so there's a little bit of arguing back and forth on the data that maybe it's just close to the number of people who were displaced in World War II. Neither one of those is really the neighborhood you want to be in, though. It says a lot about how the magnitude of this crisis. And we take a look at the magnitude of the crisis. When you have a global problem like this, it's really a time, even though this light seems to have gone out, that the United States could serve as a leader. And I just don't see our country doing that anymore. It's been waning for a few decades now, but it really seems to be on the decline right now. And certainly no other country is stepping up. China is interring Muslims in the West as rapidly as they can in these re-education camps. For as much as China is described as an economic power, it's certainly not a moral leader in the world. Mm-hmm. Germany isn't able to step up, even though they have tried. And so there is a vacuum, essentially, of leadership here. Now, we look at the United States. It's common for Americans to think that we take in the largest number of people in the world. We do not. In October, there was actually a net of 0 new refugees taken into the United States, based on federal statistics. Mm-hmm. So there are so many things at play here. Probably one of the major problems right now, if we want to look at how the Trump administration is distinct from predecessors who also took a tough line on immigration, it's that there's really not a cohesive policy. And that's what really gets into a lot of the stories that are making news today. And so you have talk, for example, of what's been referred to but really hasn't been negotiated very successfully across the globe, the idea of a safe third country agreement where an asylum seeker might not get their first choice of country to enter, but they will still instead be able to find entry into a safe third country. The agreements that the United States has negotiated since the summer are with Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, the countries that are frequently referred to as the Northern Triangle. These are, even if we think of all the active fire zones in the world, these are the 3 deadliest countries in the world right now, with Honduras at the top of those. And so even though doublespeak has taken on a whole new meaning in 2019, nobody quite has the chutzpah to call those three countries safe third countries. So instead, these agreements have been referred to as asylum cooperation agreements, where people who are trying to present themselves at the U.S. border will instead be sent to, or in some cases, sent back to those countries.
Right, and this is, it sounds so innocent in a way, but from my reading, this represents a grotesque distortion of a worldwide tradition of asylum, in the notion that you are sending people directly back to the nation that they sought asylum from, which inevitably is a death sentence for many.
For many it is. There's a different form of perversion at work here. Imagine, if you will, a Cuban or a Nicaraguan or a Venezuelan asylum seeker. They wouldn't be sent back to their home country that they're fleeing from under this agreement, but they would instead find themselves on a plane to Honduras, Guatemala, or El Salvador, which is, for people fleeing those three countries, is definitely for people fleeing Nicaragua. They did not trade up by entering one of these three other countries.
Right. But by any stretch. So what are the implications? I mean, you've had other countries, is my understanding, please correct me when I'm wrong, not if, but when I'm wrong, but you've had other countries establish relations like this, but ultimately it was always the intent for the asylum seeker to get some level of relief, if you will. So seeing the inevitability of how, as we like to say here at the Coalition, of how the movie ends, we know how this movie ends. Has there been any public reaction from the Trump administration whatsoever?
This is something that's lauded as a success by the Trump administration. This is something that is keeping, allegedly, more people from fleeing to the United States. And part of the reason that I think the optics there are so successful is that Mexico has essentially established tent cities along major border cities, Juarez, Matamoros, Tijuana, where people who are hoping to receive asylum by presenting themselves at the U.S. border are waiting. And these city is not a misnomer. There are thousands of people waiting for entry. And in December, we may not be Rhode Island, but Juarez is not a great place to be in a tent at night.
Right. No, and having had a brief opportunity to visit some of the conditions that asylum seekers who were stuck on the other side of the border, if you will, have to face, it's I mean, we're talking a humanitarian and health crisis here, potentially, on areas that are already challenged economically. Some of them are desperately poor areas. I mean, you get away from I think folks have this concept of every border crossing being like Tijuana, with American manufacturers just on the other side, and this gay town center where people are engaging in trade and American college students are having too much to drink. That's the aberration. That is not even remotely. I mean, talk about Palomas, Mexico. I mean, again, and this is not to disparage the people there. I met some wonderful people who send their children to school every day in the United States. You've got a real, from my sense as an outsider, a real community spirit between Palomas and Deming and some of the other border towns. But, when you look at a real border town, if you will, like that, what are some of the economics there? How desperate are some of these communities?
Well, they're extremely desperate. I've mentioned previously that Mexico's made great strides in infrastructure, but in some areas it still hasn't. Palomas is a great place to visit. If you're looking for well-paved roads, though, that's not the place to go.
Right.
And or if you're looking for a potable water system, that's not the place to go. But I don't want to, have us just dunking on Mexico here, because those are things that are still coming to parts of the United States as well. So
Flint.
The city of Columbus, the village of Columbus, its water system was potable, but it wasn't. It still degraded local residents' teeth until just 10 years ago.
Wow.
I mean, this is the first decade of the 21st century that municipal water system was up to the specs that other people would tolerate.
So, on top of all of this, we have the continued, if you will, for lack of a better term, degradation of the government structure throughout Mexico at the state level. And it's important to understand that the Mexican government, you've got a federal government there, but it would appear from an outsider's perspective that, much like the United States, so much of local policy and, as a result, the living conditions of people in that communities are dictated at the state level. Am I correct in that? Where does real policy hit the road for most Mexicans?
To some degree, that's true, but the real problem here is the same problem that we have. It's not a question of whether or not there are resources, it's how they're distributed. And so last time we talked about that horrific cartel attack in Sonora, just not too far across the border, where the Mormon colonist families were very brutally murdered. Basically when Mexico is sending Sikhs back to India in order to do a favor for the Trump administration and prevent those folks from presenting themselves at the U.S. border, that's money that they're not spending on trying to interdict cartel activity. It's money that they're not spending on infrastructure. All the money that we're spending on these various enterprises, these various endeavors, there are so many other ways to spend this funding. But the reality is that, in a lot of ways, we're talking about a resource misallocation. In Mexico's case, it's particularly onerous because we're talking about the expenditure of money, of Mexican tax dollars, to further U.S. policy.
How is that met with the citizenry of Mexico? How strong, and this is, the fact that I'm asking you this question, and I'm so very political, is an indictment, if you will, of the American media, because, like so many Americans, I see Mexico as this sporadic outbreak of incredible amounts of violence, followed by nothingness. Is the citizenry up in arms? Have they been cowed, if you will, by this rampant narco terrorism, which seems to be spiking again?
They tend to try to find accommodations. And not to belabor, not to keep trying to put the United States and Mexico on an even keel, but we might as well ask how the residents of Miami are dealing with living in that city after the police opened fire in broad daylight against thieves,
right?
Not murderers, but thieves,
right? And
murdered their hostage and wounded several bystanders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, go back many years to the riots in Miami, and it was interesting that the UK government, of all folks, pointed out the hypocrisy of Americans' condescending attitude towards, perhaps borderline first, second, and third world nations, when in fact atrocities like that happen in America, far too often.
They do.
Well.
And I don't want to diminish the United States by saying that. What I want to say is that it's far too easy to fall into the temptation of demeaning these other countries and minimizing the problems that we have here.
Right. We have schools that are in outright failure. We've got issues with water systems and basic infrastructure around the nation breaking down. And, all one need to do is read the Department of Justice 2 reports on Ferguson to understand that racially, we can't go looking towards other people's treatment of indigenous natives with any air of superiority whatsoever. Yikes.
Ferguson's an interesting case to mention because, you asked me about my class load for the spring. I'm smiling when I say this because that's my inappropriate reaction to everything. My class on Latin America and the Cold War is essentially, unless you study the Holocaust, it's a study in the worst possible treatment of human beings by other human beings. It is the darkest of dark material. It is death squads. It is soccer stadium massacres.
Right.
It is the disappearance of men and women and children. It's children cut out of their mother's womb and adopted by military families. All of this goes on at a time like that in these places that we dismissed as developing. But you just mentioned Ferguson. And, we should be terrified by how many of the Ferguson activists have been turning up dead in the last year and a half. Mm-hmm. And how fruitless the leads are to this point to identify the people who are burning Ferguson activists to death in their own cars, or other blatant, other horrific crimes.
No, this past week on let's just say he hasn't been met with violence. A week ago on our show, we covered the case of the curious, not so curious case of Ross Ulbricht, who was the in charge, the creator of the Silk Road internet site, and we had his mother on to discuss. While the treatment hasn't been brutal, the double life sentence for essentially an economic crime is stunning. The level of corruption in the federal government's judicial system in trying to foist upon him criminal charges of a violent nature is stunning. And the fact that there are, at this point, federal officers who are incarcerated because of theft related to the investigation. So, yeah, you're right. I've seen the enemy, and he is us.
I regret that I'm not very familiar with that case, but you take a look at the course of the drug wars, and I mean the number of it's especially bad when you could break it down by race and ethnicity and gender. But the number of people in the United States that are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes
is staggering. As a libertarian, I think you know how I feel about the war on drugs, which is, the genesis of yours and my meeting, if you will, to start out with, as well as immigration. And so speaking about incarceration and corruption at the highest level, how's that for a segue? We are now faced with the spectacle of one of the triads, if you will, one of those three countries, the Honduras, the brother of the president. And on a humorous side, you think back to Bill Clinton's brother-in-law or Jimmy Carter's brother, and it seems so humorous, but you have the spectacle of the brother of a sitting president of a partner in America's war on immigration and quote-unquote war on drugs being found guilty of drug trafficking. Holy cow. Tell us more, please.
So the brother Antonio Hernandez, and I need to say too, in case anybody's listening who perhaps isn't as familiar with Hispanic surnames or Latino surnames, there's no relation here. This is the Smith of Latino surnames, or Garcia. These are the Smith and Jones.
Right.
So when I say that Antonio Hernandez was convicted of drug trafficking, no relation here.
Okay.
But yes, he was. And I think that one of the most telling things is that the testimony in the trial, witnesses corroborated that the president of Honduras had benefited financially and was involved in the trafficking himself as well. And there are mass demonstrations in Honduras centered on that. But of course, the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was not put on trial yet, and is dismissing the charges. So shockingly, says that he's not guilty. But there was some pretty compelling evidence that, yes, that he was involved and has benefited.
Well, when you look at the economic power of the cartels in general, and I know that there's one can, and again, feel free to challenge my analogy here. In the way that in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that we used to follow the Gambino families and the different, the mafia families, one could almost and should analyze the various drug trafficking cartels, particularly in an era when you've got El Chapo, being taken away, his son going through the process. I guess happens when a son emerges as the new power in charge of a cartel. You've got this mass, this chaos, this change happening amongst the cartels. How do we find that? How are we shocked, if you will, that this doesn't extend itself to the political leadership at the highest level? I mean, should we be surprised by this at this point?
If you're paying attention, you probably shouldn't be, but it's easy not to pay attention, right?
Right. I mean, who? I guess to your question, who in the United States is following the nuances of power shifting in Central American countries? Well, the quick answer is no one, and the answer should be everyone.
So, I mean, you do have the professionals, the as gutted as the State Department is, it has highly competent people who study this sort of thing. I will guarantee you, though, that there are a larger number of Hondurans who are in the U.S. without documentation, or who are here legally and who are further convinced they don't want to go home, or who are sitting at one of these tent cities on the border knowing that there's no way that they can return to that it's worth sitting there in hives of crime and communicable disease, suffering in the hopes that they don't have to go back. And I do want to make a distinction, too. There's a bit of a skein at work here, but to some degree we have cartel activity, and to some degree we have gang activity that are tied into these various webs of drug trafficking in other countries. Mexico's most certainly known, cartel is most commonly associated with Mexico, and some of those cartels have reached into other countries in Central America. But there's quite a bit of highly organized gangs that are involved here as well. And that's especially true in Honduras and El Salvador.
I think after the Christmas holiday, we could probably spend an hour talking about, because you've just brought up a real revelation to me. Where do the gangs begin and end, and where do the cartels begin and end? How do we distinguish between the two? I mean, there's a symbiosis there. That's stunning, but at the same time, they are very distinct animals. We've all been treated to all the stories now about MS-13, thanks to our president. I mean, who should we fear the most as Americans?
We should fear those of us who aren't paying attention to what's going on more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
None of us wants to have MS-13 at the Thanksgiving dining table.
Mm-hmm.
These are hardened criminals. But I have a fear of sharks too. I'm just not. That's probably not the way I'm going to check out. You can have a healthy fear of things, but we need to keep a sense of proportion.
Right.
And as far as where the problem began, so now you can be awake at 3 a.m. when I am. The gang problem in Central America, if it did not begin in U.S. prisons, it was exacerbated by them, by the number of asylum seekers in the 80s who were fleeing those countries, who were serving sentences in U.S. prisons, principally in Los Angeles, but in other major cities, who were then absorbed into gangs in those prisons as a survival mechanism. And once their time was done, they were deported back to their home country and brought some very sought-after skills with them.
Which opens up another avenue of approach and reproach to the American war on drugs, because, again, mass incarceration proved to be, if you will, a petri dish for advanced criminal techniques. And think of mass incarceration, if you will, and I'm not trying to be a punk here, but it's sort of the Facebook of criminal activity. You bring together people who may or may not come from a violent background into close quarters with people who are extremely violent and live in an extra-legal society within the prison community. What the hell do we think is going to happen? I mean, should we be surprised?
I think too many people are. I think that most of them shouldn't be. If we look at the prison system, what elements of it can we sincerely say are geared towards rehabilitation? Mm-hmm. And so to go back to that point about resource allocation earlier, most states spend twice as much on each prisoner that they house than they spend on each pupil in a public school.
Yeah. So what we've got is a complete rat's nest, is what you're telling me.
There is, which I guess means the good news is you pick one problem and start at it, and it'll impact the others, but there sure are a lot of problems.
If you're the State Department of these United States, and all of a sudden your ambassador is confronted with the reality, you can't even really pretend at this point. How do you maintain government relationships with a known drug trafficker? It seems like we've reached that sort of final threshold where we can't even pretend that family is a family of honor, if you will, for lack of a better term. What do we do?
They continue to do so. They will not legitimize these governments under, high profile engagements and things like that. But let's take Nicaragua for an example. We now have had a run of several very competent ambassadors under multiple administrations that have served there. And they don't spend their public time having dinner with the Ortegas. They spend their public time in mass, which is itself a critique of the administration and has cracked down on the Catholic Church in that country.
Interesting.
And so this is anecdotally what I have observed, how the professional diplomats can reconcile when they're serving in a place that's a kleptocracy or in a criminal organization.
Interesting. So, if you will, I'll call it, for lack of a better term, the Jesuit model, where you've got, a priesthood that is actively engaged in reform politics. That's essentially what we can see as a legitimate door to the people of that country?
So they have to be very careful because I cannot speak for any of these people. I can just tell you what the things that I've informally observed. Professional diplomats will go to great pains to not give the appearance of endorsing the opposition of any country. Mm-hmm. But you can, in many of these countries, it's hard to realize in the United States, but, the act of attending Mass can be a political statement. The act of having dinner with a priest.
Mm-hmm. And essentially sidestepping the quote-unquote traditional established government. Yeah, no, I can see how that works. And, there's clearly a historical record of great courage amongst a variety of the priests and nuns who have worked in some of the most dangerous environments really on the planet. It's stunning. It's stunning to watch. And at the same time, these folks have to do this sort of political tap dance just merely to survive. I don't know how they do it.
I don't either, because these are folks who find nuance in every single action. Right. And that's a degree of sophistication that I, frankly, would like to have but do not.
Well, and that, I guess one of my indictments of the Trump administration is promoting this vision that folks who are truly professionals in statecraft and relationships at that level have been dumbed down to a degree. There's always been a tradition of, the ambassador to Ireland being a campaign contributor.
Right.
We get that. If you're going to Denmark, odds are you're some wealthy high-tech guy from Utah or something who's going to enjoy the skiing. Okay, but on the other token, there's always been the unspoken belief that if you're going to India, Pakistan, if you're going to Central America, you're going to Latin America, certainly if you're going to Eastern Europe, you're a pro. You're supposed to be an adult. And what's stunning is that the President of the United States, regardless of your political affiliation, has done a great deal to disparage the professionalism of those folks and to also disparage and to, quite frankly, chew up, spit out, and throw up in his Wheaties the steps that lead to engagement, that the rest of the world, regardless how some Trump fan in Pennsylvania feels, all right, means something. Constructive engagement, in China was to a certain degree a disaster, but at the same time, folks worked aggressively to keep channels open, free of sort of this day-by-day tilt-a-whirl ride of politics. How important is it to honor that tradition of engagement through nuance, through speech, through sometimes literally a political version of smoke signals? How important is that to the structure of the world politics?
It's critical, and you can see it in Ronan Farrow's book on diplomacy just a few years ago, and you can even see it in Journal Mattis's comments if you're not going to fund the State Department, you have to buy more bullets. Essentially, diplomacy is your first resort, and deployment of the military is your last resort.
Or it
in an ideal world,
right?
That has been the ideal in the past several decades. In general, if you were the U.S. ambassador to France under any administration, you were a donor. You were a very generous donor, and that's true for several high-profile countries. In general, if you were the ambassador to Albania, you were a career diplomat. And that was certainly a critical post in and of itself. That's a country trying to get into NATO. So there's some important work to be done there as well. The interesting thing about Nicaragua, and I'll try to remember to send you some stuff to look over here. But there have been times that the U.S. ambassador to Nicaragua was a political donor instead of a professional diplomat. And essentially, the U.S. paid. This happened in the early 70s, where a member of the State Department whose wife was very active in northern Los Angeles, the family had some money. They were able to bundle significant donations to the Nixon administration. This ambassador's previous post was the Bahamas, and he spoke not a word of Spanish, which I would think would be impossible in Southern California, but apparently he achieved that. And became not a word of Spanish and became the U.S. ambassador to Nicaragua. And he was a great friend of the Somoza administration, and the United States was essentially surprised that the Sandinistas were such an effective guerrilla movement because the ambassador had minimized all of that information for several years.
Appointments, elections have consequences, don't they?
They all do.
They all do. The last subject we're going to cover for tonight, and if you're just joining me, Professor Andy Hernandez is joining us from the Western New Mexico University, and on a monthly basis provides us with insight, analysis on issues in the news cycle, or maybe hidden below the news cycle, of what's happening on the border, and how that reflects both in our foreign policy, but it also how it reflects in the culture and also reflects in our economy. It's just wonderful stuff to talk about. Trump's narco terrorism label. The New York Times is opining that the narco terrorism label could backfire. How could that backfire? It's what are the implications of these grand announcements when we categorize individuals, groups, cultures?
Well, one of the first would be that it will strengthen asylum applications, because the countries that, when we look at Central America, and it appears that there will now we're beginning to see an uptick in people leaving Mexico for the United States. More people will be able to claim validly. It will strengthen those claims for asylum. They're fleeing terrorists. At the moment, fleeing a death threat by a cartel is not necessarily seen as a valid reason to be granted asylum in the United States. So when you have an administration that lacks a cohesive policy, this is how you get negotiated accords where the Northern Triangle becomes the destination, the forced destination for asylum seekers, but also you inadvertently strengthen the applications of people who are seeking asylum.
Clear us
so there's a bit of irony there, but I mean it plays out in a lot of other ways too.
Clear up a central concept for us, and I thought about this after you were on a few weeks ago, and I realized that folks need a better grasp on this. I need a better grasp on it. You've got the traditional late-night CNN/Fox News videos of folks. Now we're treated to, and I take great humor in this. It's almost like an Olympic sport now. These new barriers that are being erected, how easily and how quickly folks can just scale them, or in some cases saw through them, or it's one of those dark, humorous moments when you realize that the entire electoral effort of the President of the United States was based on building something that was even more flawed structurally than we would have ever believed. But contrast, if you will, from a New Mexican perspective, the folks who are actively walking across and seeking asylum versus the people who are, quote unquote, jumping the fence, to use the term. Are all the folks, quote unquote, jumping the fence going to try and go through the asylum system, or do you still? Or what's the difference between the two? And that's the most asked question I've gotten from people who've listened to us talk.
So the whole point of forcing people to stay in these 10 cities in Mexico is to keep them from being able to present themselves to a Border Patrol agent and ask for asylum. Mm-hmm. Because the United States is legally required to admit that person, to hold the hearing, to do the background check, all of those things. So the whole reason that these folks are being stopped short of the border is to prevent them from being able to legally make that claim. There was one pretty dark episode earlier this fall. We have to remember that the wall is not built right on the border, right? Because we can't have construction crews standing in Mexico building the wall. Mm-hmm. So there's actually the perceived cession of land by placing the border 15 feet, 20 feet, 100 feet, whatever it is, sometimes a bit further, especially in the case of South Texas. There's a whole neighborhood that's going to end up behind the wall. Near Laredo, there's a golf course behind the wall that'll end up on the wrong side. But there was one particular incident where U.S. Army personnel were arrested at gunpoint by Mexican officials. They were still in U.S. territory, but because they were on the wrong side of the wall, it appeared that they were in Mexican territory. So that took some time to sort out as well. But you may have people who are cutting through or crossing the wall, more likely crossing than cutting. But some of these may seek asylum. Some of these may just want to enter the United States for work. And some of them may be criminals. But that would be a distinctly smaller number. Criminals tend to be involved. The way that drug trafficking organizations seem to work, there are parts of the wall where you can pass things across pretty. It's not that impossible, but when you're talking about cutting holes in the wall, there's a very sophisticated piece of this where there are a few sections where cutters have used a form of putty that is colored to resemble the welds that American engineers put in place to make it look like the wall has been repaired. So that basically just becomes a convenient drop box if it's small, or a convenient crossing point if it's bigger.
All of this would be supremely entertaining if this were a movie with the right characters, sort of a Peter Sellers treatment, or who's the guy who does the Zach Galifianakis in The New Age, all right? But it's real, and it's happening right now as we speak.
It is, and to some degree, this was basically preordained, right? I mean, the Border Patrol, the U.S. government, Homeland Security, they classified all of the strength tests on the fence because, for what should be fairly obvious reasons now, right? A $100 mechanical saw can cut through the bollards. But, on top of it, the Border Patrol leadership will still say, this measure being effective was contingent on more personnel. But the Border Patrol is one of the federal agencies that has the biggest problem recruiting personnel right now. That I don't think they have hit their official strength in the 21st century at any point. But tragically, it's also, unless anything's changed perhaps in the last 2 weeks, the agency of the federal government that has the most number of employees subject to disciplinary action or removal.
Wow.
So there was never a condition where the Border Patrol was going to have the staffing to be able to effectively police the fence.
Right. We could do an entire show, and we probably should. Obviously, if even myself, who spent just the barest amount of time in the area, came to understand very quickly I don't want to say the tensions, but clearly, in certain areas, employment in the Border Patrol is lucrative to what the local job market may offer. And the challenges of being part of the Border Patrol, in an area which is so culturally diverse, and I can't even imagine how to approach that issue in talking to people down there. I just out of respect, that's got to be a real challenge.
It's difficult, and I guess here's maybe one way to make a differentiation. You asked who's climbing and who's cutting and that sort of thing. You can generally tell the difference in the level of desperation that's involved. Somebody who's climbing that is reasonably desperate.
Yeah.
Now, by comparison, in one of last year's Homeland Security reports, it's painful to say this, but the people who are criminals are the ones who are behaving smartly. If you want to get marijuana into the United States, there were 3 occasions in 2017, 2018, according to Homeland Security, where ultralights were flown across the border. And the Border Patrol was not able to pinpoint the flight path of the ultralights or where they landed.
Right.
You're not carrying people seeking asylum in ultralights. You're probably carrying bundles of pot.
Right. And these are not
because if you're carrying fentanyl, you enter through the designated crossing points because that's much easier to smuggle.
And ultimately, the real challenge here is that these cartels, and if in fact your distribution arms are in fact gangs, have been able to amass such wealth that they have the technology. There is enough of an upside for them to invest in significant technology to continue their business. And again, who is funding that technology? American citizens.
We talked about all of these different problems, and I mentioned how resources are allocated a couple of times now, but AMLO is still a very popular president. López Obrador, is still a very popular president in Mexico. And I think one place where he has legitimately made steps towards making an impact is that Mexico recognizes the alarming degree to which weapons are being smuggled from the United States into Mexico. And one thing that may have been in place when you were here, I'm not sure. It's a very recent change, though. The entry into Palomas used to simply be, this metal bar that would be raised when you were waved through, and sometimes the bar would just permanently be in the up position. Well, at checkpoints all along the Mexican border now, they actually have much more sophisticated equipment for checking things like suspicious cavities in vehicles. For being able to search vehicles to see if people are trying to smuggle weapons in.
Right.
What they don't have, though, is a similar problem to what the Border Patrol has. They don't have the staffing all the time. And so this past fall, I crossed once where people were being subjected to very heightened scrutiny. And I crossed last week over Thanksgiving, and essentially people were waved through. Those are some impressive changes to Mexico's border security, and they have the chance to be very effective. But, Mexico has to have the resources to be able to appropriately staff those. And when they're enforcing our immigration policy, that's money that they're not spending on their own security.
Right. Well, what can I say? In a moment like this, when we always come to a point in the conversation as we're kind of bringing it to a close, you recognize the enormity of the issues. And the enormity of the challenges, sobering to say the least. But I also have to take a moment to wish you, again, first of all, thank you for joining us tonight. Wish you and your
always
family,
a pleasure.
Wish you and your family the happiest and the merriest of Christmas. Send me some pictures of what it's like to celebrate Christmas in the desert. And again, it's. I think we're going to try and get you on once quickly before the end of the month or right after the new year, and particularly if situations, the news cycle hits again. But if I don't get a chance to have you on the air again before, just again, thank you so much for your contribution this year, and we've got some real great ideas for what we're going to do in the spring. And again, I can't thank you enough. It's just a wonderful conversation, and again, the challenge for all of us is how do we blow the conversation up so it becomes more of a global conversation? And I think that's something you and I are going to work on to tackle for the new year. But again, Merry Christmas to you and your family, and I look forward to working with you in the new year.
Likewise, Pat. It is always. I greatly enjoy being here and being able to reach out, and I'm very much looking forward to being able to continue to do that.
All right, buddy. Well, Professor Andrew Hernandez of the Western New Mexico University. We are going to get a handle on how you can sign up for his class on narco terrorism. I have never taken a class online. This may be my chance. All I will say is, Professor, is, I'm one of those older students. If I can sign up, be kind. All right? I'm one of those people who might need a little extra time on the exam. Be kind. That's all I'm going to ask. Okay?
Be prepared to write.
That's what I'm so good at. Isn't there a course I could take where you just have to be prepared to talk? Well, again, thank you so much. We're running a little bit late tonight. I want to get Connor Dragotis in. He's going to talk about red flag laws, and my apologies to Connor. I'm going to try and get him again before the year. I'm going to reach out to him right now. But again, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Network, reaching tonight to Deming, New Mexico. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. On the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. Stay tuned. We'll have Connor Dragotis with us. We'll be right back, and thanks again.